Now we cross over to our Ocean for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. The very much anticipated virtual meeting between US and Chinese Presidents Joe Biden and Xi Jinping took place Monday evening US time. Now, amid this heated rivalry and soaring tensions that we've seen between the two superpower countries over trade, technology, geopolitics and ideology, the leaders reportedly had a healthy debate, but as expected, without a breakthrough. But was the face-to-face virtual meeting of the two personalities meaningful all the same? We have an in-depth discussion ready for you with Dennis Weng, Associate Professor at Sam Houston State University, and Aaron Friedberg, Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. Very warm welcome to you both. Let's start with you, Professor Weng. Now, as the White House said before the summit took place, there were no major agreements or a joint statement that came out of this virtual meeting. So they were really downplaying the possible outcomes of this meeting. But would you say it was still progress?
Oh yeah, of course. I think there's still progress, especially if you look at this, the summit from two different angles. One is symbolic angle, and another one is a practical understanding. The symbolic way is that everyone look at watching this summit because all the country in the world worry that the China-U.S. will lead the world to the so-called new Cold War. So before the summit, everyone worried. And then after the summit, the symbolic achievement is that we all know the U.S. China is not intentionally to, take this, or the war system to a more confrontational situation. So there's no new Cold War. So for a practical meaning, we can look at how these two leaders talk to each other. The friendly atmosphere is actually creating a possibility in the future. They may have more discussion and more negotiation, especially if you understand how to deal with China. Well, you have to get the senior leader, the leader, to agree to willing to talk to each other, to talk to other country. So after this summit, we can probably predict that different level of communication, different level of negotiation can proceed. So we can have a better optimistic prediction in the future, although there's no obvious breakthrough at this moment. But as I mentioned, symbolically speaking, we see more friendly relations between U.S. China, and practically we see potential in the future the U.S. China will have some negotiation and some kind of policy debate or discussion.
Right. So it looks like these two countries, both countries went into the virtual summit without expectations of a breakthrough. But Professor Friedberg, what do you think President Biden and Xi wanted to get out of this meeting or convey to the other side?
I think on the U.S. side, there was a desire to communicate an intention to open dialogue and continue to talk, to indicate that the U.S. side at least has no intention of ratcheting up tensions, and presumably on the Chinese side something similar. I agree that there's some symbolic significance to their discussion, but I don't think that there is anything much of substance that was accomplished. And I don't think, and this is the most important point, that a meeting like this changes the fundamentals of the relationship, which in my view are leading them towards more intense competition in the future.
Well, Professor Friedberg, the atmosphere seemed nothing like the very acrimonious mood between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Alaska earlier this year in the very first government-level meeting under the Biden administration. And while President Xi Jinping, he even said that it was good to see his old friend, President Joe Biden. Do you think this has really reset the tone for bilateral engagement?
It has improved it somewhat. I don't think it's a change of great substance. If you think about these kinds of meetings, there's sort of three possibilities. One, they can be acrimonious, which the meeting in Alaska was, although that was between lower level officials, not national leaders. At the other extreme, they can be substantive and result in actual agreements and progress on specific issues, and that's not what this was. or something in between. They can be an exchange of views, more or less cordial, that's intended to promote an atmosphere of dialogue and so on. I think that was the point of this meeting, and that's essentially what it accomplished. It doesn't seem that either side went into the meeting with a specific agenda of things that it wanted to achieve. Also, clearly, neither of these two leaders is particularly confrontational. It would have been surprising if they had debated or argued in the way that their subordinates did in Alaska. So it's about what one would have expected.
Right, so despite these surprising pleasantries, it seems that both Mr. Biden and Mr. Xi, they won't be budging on their stances on fundamental issues, particularly the flashpoint issue of Taiwan. And ahead of the summit, both countries exchanged stern warnings over the island, and President Biden reportedly told his counterpart not to undermine peace in Taiwan. And while Professor Weng, now Mr. Biden, he caused some confusion in recent weeks with his remark that Washington would come to Taiwan's defense against Beijing. Do you think the US is going to continue to show strategic uncertainty?
Yes, indeed. I think President Biden recently mentioned like Taiwan agreement or the commitment to Taiwan is kind of because, like you mentioned, the confusion. But fundamentally, the strategic ambiguity is a long-term policy for U.S.-Taiwan relations, and it will continue. And President Biden noticed that this is important, like fundamental foundation for the U.S.-China-Taiwan relations. Most of the people in recent years, especially in response to the recent Chinese actions in the Taiwan Strait, people people questions whether the strategic ambiguity is still appropriate for the U.S.-Taiwan relations, whether U.S. should show more like strategic clarity, leaning toward like supporting or counter Taiwan's defense, whether that will be helpful. But in fact, it's best of U.S. interest is to keep this ambiguity, because that will keep the both sides of Taiwan Strait unsatisfied. As I mentioned, it's imperfectly, fit with what people need across Taiwan Strait, imperfectly fit also the U.S. interest. So the strategic ambiguity will make sure that Taiwan will continue to do the job and also continue to have like workable relations with the U.S. Same thing, the strategic ambiguity will make the China, the PRC, willing to continue to negotiate and talk to the U.S. government. So there, in the foreseeable future, I don't foresee that any change will come to like a I don't foresee any change in terms of strategic ambiguity. Strategic clarity is not good for any part of the Taiwan Strait.
I'd like to get your thoughts on this, Professor Friedberg. I mean, amid this, a couple of weeks ago, we heard from a Pentagon report that the Chinese military, it's been rapidly expanding and it's modernizing, and it's intending to coerce Taiwan into unification talks by 2027. Do you think Washington can continue its policy of strategic uncertainty, or do you think it's going to have to perhaps take a clearer stance?
I think the policy of strategic ambiguity as a declaratory policy is going to continue, because there is no obvious advantage from the U.S. side to changing it. There's no desire to provoke Beijing unnecessarily. At the same time, I think what's really important is the shifting balance of military power across the strait. China has been building up its military over a period now of 3 decades. With focus on preparing for possible use of force against Taiwan. The other thing that's worth mentioning is if there have been heightened tensions across the strait in the last 6 to 8 months, it's because of what China has been doing, flying aircraft towards Taiwan, moving ships towards the island. So China's behavior has been more aggressive and threatening. That's why there's tension. On the U.S. side, although I don't expect to see any change in the declaratory policy of strategic ambiguity, I also expect that we're going to see more efforts on the part of the United States and other countries too to help Taiwan strengthen its capacity for self-defense, and also I think to signal to the mainland that if it does use force, even though there's no explicit guarantee, it's quite likely that the United States and other countries too would come in on the side of Taiwan. Australian Defense Minister said a couple of days ago that if there were a conflict over Taiwan, it's unthinkable that Australia would not assist the United States in helping Taiwan. Japanese officials have also talked about this contingency. So the declaratory policy isn't going to change, but the arms competition and the attempt to maintain a stable balance of power on the part of the U.S. and Taiwan is going to continue, because China is not going to stop expanding its military capabilities, and it's not going to stop threatening Taiwan.
And Professor Friedberg, well, regardless of Washington and Beijing's efforts to ease tensions, do you think the US should continue to look beyond its relationship with China in order to reinforce infrastructural and economic partnerships in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's extremely important. It's important for economic reasons. It's important also for strategic reasons. One of the things that's notable, although there are many changes in tone and atmosphere between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, is that at least for the moment, the Biden administration has continued most of the policies that the Trump administration put into place regarding the Asia Pacific. So an emphasis on strengthening the Indo-Pacific, working with U.S. allies and partners, strengthening U.S. military capabilities in the region, developing stronger economic ties. I think all of that is going to go forward. And again, it's part of a larger ongoing competition between the United States and its partners on the one hand and China on the other, to determine in the long run who is going to have the dominant voice in the politics of the region. And the United States has made clear that it's not going to back away. And China, for its part, has made clear its intention to continue to expand its influence and attain what its leaders think is its rightful place in the region. So that's really the undercurrent that's important here, and more important than one meeting or the other, or one declaratory policy or the other. This has been going on for several decades, and it's going to continue.
And Professor Weng, well, there's a lot of uneasiness and nervousness around trade issues surrounding the US and China, of course, here in the Indo-Pacific. Do you think Washington is going to continue decoupling from China and really reinforcing its initiatives in the region, such as Quad and possibly Quad Plus?
Yes, of course. I think U.S. will continue decoupling with China. Well, even after the summit, as I mentioned, well, even the ultimate sphere is more friendly at this moment, but the relationship between U.S.-China fundamentally is still competition. You know, it's the long-term, ongoing, like Professor Friedberg mentioned, it's ongoing competition, and it will get worse and get more intense for sure, because China is rising. China believe they're rising. So there will be a lot of competition and intensify that. And also the way the U.S. dealing with China, the coping policy, the only concern is that the Biden administration need to be very careful and, have maybe have more strategic, consideration, because the current highly interdependence, relations situation between U.S. China is something for U.S. to consider. Why? Because if you look at the number, the trade number from since this, starting this year in January, from January to now September, the trade number, the total amount for trade, between U.S. China is now $465 billion, which is record high. And if you, in comparison to previous 2 years, this year the projected total amount for this year is going to be exceeds 700 billion. That will be probably the highest in recent years. What I'm saying is, the U.S.-China relation will fundamentally continue to compete against each other, and the coping policy is what the Biden administration certainly need to continue. But at the same time, they also have to consider how to deal with the domestic economic situation and development, because that is actually affect how Biden administration will continue to win the election, especially the 2022 midterm election is on the way.
And finally, before we go, Professor Friedberg, with President Xi having solidified his leadership over the Chinese Communist Party and his status as forever president for the country, what do you think this means for his US policy in the long run? Do you think he's simply going to wait out the Biden administration on key issues of concern?
don't know that he's going to wait out the administration. I think he's going to push ahead with the policies that he's been pursuing, which I think he believes have been successful. Chinese strategic analysts and policymakers appear to believe that the United States has entered into a relative decline in its power and that China is going to continue to rise, that it's time for China to push more assertively to advance towards its objectives, both in the Indo-Pacific region and in the world. I don't think from a Chinese perspective it matters all that much who the leaders are in the United States. I think they tend to view this relationship as being shaped by larger historical forces. The leaders matter somewhat, but they don't make the decisive difference. I think from the point of view of Beijing, this competition is intensifying, and Xi Jinping has a clear attitude towards it and intends to push forward as hard as he possibly can, regardless of who's in the White House. He may think, and his advisors may think, that the Biden administration is going to be relatively weak. He may think that it's not going to last for more than 3 years, and that perhaps a Republican will come back, and maybe even Donald Trump. In that case, maybe he might be inclined to push even harder to achieve some of the things that he wants to over the next few years. But overall, I don't think who's president makes that much difference to his calculations.
Well, I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. That was Dennis Weng, Associate Professor at Sam Houston State University, and Aaron Friedberg, Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. Thank you both so much for your insights today.
Thank you.